Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, a place where I interview tech leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, futurists, technologists, thought leaders, and even the occasional celebrity about how they are leveraging technology to transform their business. Now, I am genuinely excited about getting today's guest on the podcast because he's someone I've been following for many years. I'm very familiar with his written work. And his name is Shiv Malik. He's a technologist, award-nominated broadcaster, author of 2 books, a former Guardian investigative journalist, and co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation think tank. But when I learned that the Mail on Sunday called him a controversial figure, that was more than enough to cement him as a guest on this podcast. And Shiv joined the Web3 space, I think it was back in 2017, as an advisor to the Golem project, which is something else that I was following very closely back then, and subsequently as head of growth for Steam. But here in 2021, he co-founded Pool and currently leads the organisation on its mission to bring data unions to the world and ensure that people have control of their data and ultimately a genuine stake in the digital economy. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening, it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to Greenwich in London, where Shiv Malik is waiting to share his story and how Pool is on this mission to redistribute power, value and control in the data economy. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I'm Shiv Malik. I've had a very, peripatetic career. I've been an investigative journalist for The Guardian for several years, author of a couple of books, and I started a think tank called the Intergenerational Foundation over a decade ago. And now I am the CEO of Pool and have been for the last year and a half. I co-founded that. So, but for about 5 years now, I've been in Web3 technology.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Investigative journo, author, CEO. I've got to take you back in time before all this began. Where did your passion for tech come from? Or what was the moment that put you on the path you're on today, or ultimately as a journo and author? What's your origin story?
Yeah, I guess about in 2010, I think I got really uncomfortable with what was going on in tech. Yeah. So the call, for example, with the Huffington Post, I think was my first kind of wake up moment for me anyway. And the call from the Huffington Post was, look, hey, we're going to be part of this sort of new internet society. It's brilliant. You know, you should create all of this free content and, you know, you'll get these ideas will spread and won't it be wonderful? And then suddenly they decided to sell the Huffington Post. And they made, I think, if I remember correctly, about 300 million from the sale of that. Arianna Huffington and her investors. And then you think, oh, hang on, people are making money from this, but it isn't the people providing the value. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been a pattern that's being repeated time and time again. So come Facebook's IPO, I decided to delete my Facebook account. And I think Channel 4 News in the UK sort of found this so strange. They called me on and asked me to account for myself. So, you know, why have you deleted your Facebook account? How dare you? And I said during that kind of panel debate, if you want, that, look, I didn't want to be an info slave anymore. Yeah. I didn't want Mark Zuckerberg to continue to leech value from me personally and from, you know, everyone else on this platform. So that's always been an idea I had. And one of the books that I wrote was called Jilted Generation, again, about economics and, you know, how a kind of younger generation was going to be probably worse off than their parents. And I think now everyone agrees that certainly is the case, which is remarkable. That's never happened in modern sort of developed society for all the figures we have, including actually war, if you take it over a 10-year period. So that, I guess, is my kind of, you know, origin story. And what we do at Pool now is help foster and support with infrastructure these institutions called data unions, which are in effect an attempt to take that base layer of information that powers pretty much everything about digital society and put it back into the control of ordinary individuals and the people who generate that value.
It's incredibly cool what you're doing here. And I must check that book out. Was it Jilted Generation, you say? Because it feels like you called that pretty early on, right?
I guess we did call it early on, and we called it like a cult hit. Because it's another way of saying it didn't sell very much, but the people who did read it were certainly quite passionate about the ideas, and it went on to, I don't know, to inspire a few things. I think a playwright wrote a play based on it, and so that, you know, it much to my chagrin, I kind of ended up both being a kind of, well, being a sort of a bit of a Cassandra, you know, calling for changes that never in the end, and warning about things that have come true. But at the time, I think people thought, oh, you're just beating up on old people.
I love that. And of course, it was that path that led you to Pool, which I believe is also currently valued at something like $39 million. And you're building this data marketplace and associated payment rails for new data sharing entities, as you said a few moments ago, called data unions. But can you tell me more about the story behind the company and those problems that you set out to solve there?
Yeah, so this idea of a data union is actually pretty old. Sometimes they're called data cooperatives, data trusts, data intermediaries. And, you know, again, certain basic premises are that your data by itself not worth that much. Club together, rather like a cooperative or a union, and suddenly it's got huge value. And then you can start to command and control and have a different sort of power relationship. But you need a sort of an intermediary if you want to kind of deal with some of that stuff, because rather like with, you know, hiring a lawyer or an accountant, these things are kind of complicated. They can be a bit boring at times and certainly fiddly, but you need someone who can represent you and be a sort of fiduciary in that sense. So have your best interests at heart at all times. So it's an old idea, but where they've really struggled to get off the ground is in a couple of ways. And all of the, you know, the tide has sort of turned in their favor, but the ways in which they've struggled is, one, well, okay, if you're going to be a member of a data union, then you need to be able to pay all these people. If you have 1 million members, well, how do you pay 1 million people, you know, $2 or $3 or $5 or $7 each month? It turns out it's quite difficult in the regular fiat banking system because the charges are too high. So you have to find something else. And that something else has finally come along with blockchain and sort of layer 2 solutions, as they're known, which cost, you know, 0.055 of a cent if you want for some of these transactions. So that's great news for them on that basis. The second thing is then they need sort of marketplaces to be able to reach big audiences. And they all need, and a common marketplace would work really well. And then they need other sort of bits and bobs of kind of infrastructure. But the other big piece that's moved has also been privacy. And I think people realize, yes, privacy is a really good thing, but actually, it's actually a subset of control because we share data all the time. And we want to share it all the time. If you want Amazon to deliver something to your house, you have to tell them your address. Often you have to give people emails because you want to stay in touch. It's the real problem with all of this is not that you just want to remain in a silo and you don't want anyone to know who you are. That's only really pertinent to like a very tiny minority of people. What you want is to be able to control when that information is shared. So it's not privacy per se, it's about control of information. And I think, people have also realized that too. And that's why data unions seem far more appealing a solution than they were 5 or 10 years ago.
And as I said, you kind of called this 12 years ago in 2010, and fast forward to 2022, there's now increasing talk about the end of consumer data following Chrome's decision to delete third-party cookies. I think they've delayed it at the moment, but it's going to happen. And then we've also got new EU rules about data portability, which are due to come into effect next year, I believe. So for people that are still unaware of this, I'm sure everyone must be more than familiar, but maybe they don't know the scale of the problem and where the most powerful companies on earth are actually monopolising all of their information. Can you just expand on the scale of it and how pretty much every person has got a digital footprint that is just bigger than they possibly realise? Well,
so what Europe is doing is incredibly both brave and powerful. So what they've said is, well, first of all, they said, we really like this data union idea. So they've developed some legislation that will help back those. But the second and far more important thing is that they've said, okay, we agree. People who generate data should be able to port it around in the way that they want. Now, actually, people already have data portability rights, except how it works is that you've got to write an email to the company, wait 30 days, and then, of course, you get a file that you can't read, and it's completely defunct. And everyone in Europe knows that. And it was pretty much defunct by the time it got passed into law under GDPR. And no one particularly likes GDPR. I think from a consumer perspective, all you do is spend your time saying yes or no to cookies. And you're thinking, why on earth am I doing this? So what they've said now is, you know what we want is real-time portability. So we don't want these stupid static files. We don't want people to have to write emails or wait 30 days. We want people to just click a button. So in the same way that you sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, I'm sure most everyone listening has done that. You can then sign in to a third party who says, hey, is it all right if we port your data to this service? Now, and then all you have to do is sign in, and that's it. It's pretty much done, right? Maybe a few more clicks just to tell Google, yeah, I'm fine with it, by the way.
Yeah.
And that means now everyone in Europe, now this is obviously Europe, not the UK, but everyone in Europe, that's 450 million people, will be able, at the touch of a button, to port their Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft data, that means also LinkedIn, at the touch of a button to any other service they want, including, of course, a data union. Now, imagine a data union with all of that data, right? How powerful would that be? And all people have to do is just click a few buttons, and then suddenly they're part of this revenue-generating business. They can still use Google and Amazon and Facebook, of course, and the data union might even say, "Look, we'll help you to write. We'll write the email saying delete my historical data from these services." But it's a really, really important, huge move. It will change the balance of the data economy.
And do you think many of those big companies might try and, degrade the experience? I mean, we've already seen with the cookie situation where some websites won't even serve you, and others will say, hey, you've got to click on accept cookies on about 6 different pop-up boxes before we let you in. Do you think there's a danger of anything like that happening? So people just go, oh, okay, I'll do it. Could that happen too? Or do you think we're moving away from that finally?
It's always possible. The law is specifically targeted at these things called gatekeepers, which means it's only just those companies really that I talked about, maybe a handful more.
Yeah.
So, which means it can be policed a lot easier, right? You're not the kind of people in Europe who'll be watching over this won't have to look at 70 million different websites and how they operate with cookies, for example, or whatever it might be. It's just, 6 to 8, maybe 12 major services, and that's it. So, and the laws are really clear. They say it has to be in real time. It has to be instantly. It has to be free at a point of use. So fingers crossed. But it's pretty hard to degrade that service when you're talking about, API connections.
So we've talked about the scale of the problem here, and obviously you hinted at Paul and how you're aiming to redistribute power, value and control in this data economy. But for everyone listening, and a lot might be hearing about you for the first time, can you just walk me through how it all works?
I'll give you a little bit of a few examples of the data unions, and then I'll tell you what we do to help them. So I'll give you an example of Cake, for example, in Belgium. They're a financial transaction data union. And they say, hey, look, use open banking, which I guess is the precursor to what I was just talking about with these new laws in Europe. Connect takes, less than, under a minute or so to your bank account. And then we'll monetize that data for you. Your banks already do it. You don't see a cent. We've got Swash, which is a browser plugin. Ozone and Surf, they're all and Generate, they're all browser plugins that say, hey, look, we'll monetize your clickstream data, and we'll also give you kind of either discounts with brands. Perhaps you can, send that money to a third-party charity. So lots of offerings on that front. And there's many of these other data unions working in cars. IoT sector is starting to pop up now. Wellness. So monetize your, in effect, Fitbit data. So all very exciting. What Pool does is you say, okay, look, our first step is to say all data unions need to monetize that data to really provide that value back. So we're going to create a marketplace, which is out in October. And it's the world's basically first marketplace that just totally focuses on aggregated but pseudonymized sort of personal data. So data about people, information about people that's fully consensual. That's what, the lingo is sort of zero party. So we've heard about third party cookies. Imagine if it's just coming directly from people, where it's come from. And data buyers absolutely love it. They're like, great, finally, products we can be proud of purchasing, proud of using, that are easy and clean. And again, from their perspective, it's stuff that's not the byproduct of people's digital activities. It's the product, right? So it's clean data, it's well governed. This is just the stuff that they love.
Love that. And of course, it is a very complex area, and a lot of people find it a little bit daunting and overwhelming. But I believe your mission is actually to simplify these guardrails so consumers and businesses can benefit, right?
Yeah, our mission is to redistribute power, value, and control in the data economy. So in a sense, I guess, taking me back to that Facebook moment in 2011, 2012. So in that sense, we're enabling these data unions to have those proper consumer relationships, and really acting as the kind of the fundamental layer in all of this, the base layer for changing things up. I can, the second move then, of course, once you create a marketplace, is then to start to provide all sorts of new things that just don't exist by working together with all the other data unions, so in a cooperative fashion. And there's a really interesting dynamic where, these data unions are part unions, they represent people, but they're part cooperatives, right? They're taking a common asset and trying to leverage market power to return that value back to its members. So think of farmer cooperatives where they all sell grain together because they get a better price for it. So they have a dynamic where they tend to work together because they believe in cooperation. Surprise, surprise. So, the next step is to really then build out an analytics solution. And that means that, anyone in the world who's a business who wants to know, okay, well, what is the case with people who earn over 50,000, pounds a month, a year? What websites do they click on? Do they click on shoes that I want to sell? Do they run marathons? And if they run marathons, then what do they click on? Right? It's sort of that level of detail. And that service just doesn't exist at the moment for anyone in the world. So that'll be the next step.
And there's so much excitement and indeed hype around Web3. And I know it's a subject you're very passionate about. So what are the biggest challenges you see in needing to overcome and ensure that everyone gets a stake in that Web3 digital future?
So, at first, I've been on this journey for a while now. And you've been sort of writing, talking, and helping to build and support data unions all together for about 4.5 years or so. So it's been a longish journey. I mean, there's people who've been at it a bit longer than I have, but hopefully I've come along at just the right moment. And, if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said, the buyers would be, the issue. Will they actually buy these data union, the products? And now all of those kind of qualms are out the window, especially with the deletion of third-party cookies. So when that comes to an end, lots of sources of data will just dry up for people, and they're desperate to replace those sources of data with something else. And then, of course, the question was then, well, look, how difficult is it to build a data union? And we've now seen some really well-funded data unions really starting to build out the tech solution. And I think the last qualm now is really with people. Can data unions really provide value? We're entering costs of living crises around the world. Is $5 to $10 a month really going to cut it with people? I think it will. What else can they provide in terms of value? Will they be able to help with not just privacy solutions, but convenience? People will do a lot for convenience. Whether that's, autofill or digital identity, or helping with one-click purchases or getting discounts or special access. I think, that's really, now where we are with the data union ecosystem. How can these data unions really be just a little bit more creative? And who are the real clear winners in all of this? We've got data unions with 100 to 200,000, lots of those. We've got a few touching now 1 million and beyond. Can we get to 5 million? Can we get to 10 million?
Wow. Well, you've had such a varied and exciting career, from being that guy on the news, warning on the dangers of moving faster and breaking things and appearing like a heretic and calling things early, and everything that you've seen and the insights that you've shared along those years. What would you say is the biggest lesson or the biggest lessons that you've learned throughout your career in tech?
Firstly, it would be teams are really, really important. They're just massively important. The dynamic and the culture of a company really set the tone. I've watched and been part of companies who've raised, millions, hundreds of millions in some cases, and they don't succeed because their company culture isn't right. And you're like, how is that? They've got so much money. Surely they could just solve any problem. I think that's really, for me, something I thought that was quite soft and maybe a bit squidgy, and you can always change it, but it's actually really difficult to reset a company culture once it's set off. How people feel personal responsibility for what they do, whether they even just show up properly, especially in a world where things are distributed and people work from home, whether they're committed to the cause of what you're doing and the mission statement of the project. These are all things that need to be really deeply thought about at the beginning, implemented really well or embedded really well, because they're impossible to change afterwards. That's probably the single greatest lesson that I think I've learned.
Fantastic. And of course, we've talked about the problems that big tech has unwittingly created and led us to this point, but we are getting to a point now where we're changing things. We're working towards Web3. So what excites you about that future that we're building now?
Oh, gosh. There's so much to be excited about. There's also so much, I'll be honest, right? There's a lot to be despondent about with... Yeah, crypto is just a wild place full of drama. I think it's the best way to put it. There are plenty of people who are out there who realize, oh, look, I can scam others. I can manipulate people's sense of aspiration towards making lots of money, i.e. greed, and be nefarious about it. On the other hand, I think it's hard to meet people who are as massively gifted, intelligent, bright, and creative as I have in Web3. And when really the best way to test all of that out is to actually go to a really legitimate conference, usually run, I'm part of the Ethereum community rather than the Bitcoin community. And those conferences for me really lay out people's, who people are and why they're there. And there's so much, being part of Web3 now since very early 2017. And I've seen so much talked about and then built, and it's happened. So it isn't just thin air. We've seen a huge rise in DeFi technology. And I can do things now that I couldn't do 2.5 years ago. It's absolutely remarkable. I can take a quick loan out. I can stake money and know that it is really safe. One of the interesting, I don't know how deep you want me to go on it, but DeFi really does work, and centralized solutions certainly in Web3 have pretty much all failed.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and share your story with me today. We began talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. But before I let you go, I'm going to ask you to leave everyone listening with one final gift from your insights. And that is a book that has inspired you, or maybe a song that has inspired you or important to you, helps you get your head in the zone. We'll add the book to our Amazon wishlist or a song to a Spotify playlist. All I'm going to ask is, what is your choice? And is there a story behind that choice you're going to leave us with?
Okay, so the song would be Jimi Hendrix's Machine Gun.
Oh.
I also played piano and guitar, and it's an amazing track. I think there's a 17-minute live version. There's a few recordings of it. It was a sort of New Year's Eve concert in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, that the two main recordings were made at. And it is just an astounding piece of electric guitar. It really shows who he was as a musician. And it's got that wonderful mix of amazing ability, technical ability, plus the kind of impassioned political outrage that summed up that year, I think, of 69. Or it could have been 68 for the New Year's thing. So the book It's a toss-up between something like, I think, Debt by David Graeber.
Yeah.
It's just really totemic. And then Jaron Lanier, Who Owns the Future, which is incredibly inspirational and certainly led the way in terms of intellectual grounding for data unions. Debt by David Graeber is a much more broad depth, really in-depth sociological kind of treatise on money and where it came from. It'll blow your mind if you think you know what barter systems were and where they came from. This upends absolutely everything.
Wow, 3 great choices there. I'm going to make a promise to you. I'm going to be rocking out to Machine Gun as soon as this podcast finishes. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more about Pool and everything we've talked about, and equally checking out your books that you've written there as well, what's the best starting point for everything?
You can find us on Twitter at Pool Data. Our website is pooldata.io. I'm also on Twitter at Shiv Malik. Reach out, get in touch, especially if you're an innovator thinking about building a data union. Brilliant. Reach out. We've got a growth team who can speak to you and or me. I can have a chat. I'd love talking to new innovators. It's my favorite thing.
Well, as I said, a big thank you for coming on here today. You've had an exciting career as a technologist, award-nominated broadcaster, author of 2 books, former Guardian investigative journalist, and co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation think tank. And here you are now with Pool and building a better future with this data marketplace. It's incredibly exciting what you're doing. I'd love to stay in touch with you, see where it leads to, maybe get you back on in the new year. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing all that with me and leaving us with 2 books and a great tune to boot. So thanks for joining me today, Shiv.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's just always incredibly humbling. So thank you.
There are just so many things I love about Shiv, especially about how he's using technology to make a difference and change the world for the better. And you could just tell there's a great moral compass on him there. But despite having a hugely successful career, he remains remarkably humble, and I think that really came across in our conversation today. So when they say never meet your idols, in this case, I will say ignore it, because Shiv has completely exceeded my expectations and then some. But today you've heard the story of Shiv Malik. But what about you? What about your story? I want to hear from you too. But a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.